Hi guys, welcome back to CodeMasterCoach, your medical coding tutor. Today we start our series on the 2018 ICD-10-CM coding updates. Now I realize I've heard from so many of you that you would like to start the coding guidelines as a series and not just the 2018 updates, but that you'd like to review them in their entirety for those of you that are starting from ground zero. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the two. So let me first start off by showing you what the 2018 updates, give you a summary of what the 2018 updates look like. Okay? I've got a chart that I put together and I want to show it to you. As you can see here, it says ICD-10-CM updates for 2018. And I separated it by chapter changes that were made, or the number of changes that were made per chapter. So for infectious and parasitic diseases, there were two changes. Neoplasm had 9 changes. The blood chapter had 0. Endocrine 6. Mental 11, nervous 3. The eye chapter had 70 changes. Moving on over, ear 0 changes. Circulatory 38 changes. Respiratory 1 change. Digestive 25 changes. Skin 72 changes. Musculoskeletal 14. The GU 22 changes. Pregnancy 44 changes. Perinatal 11, congenital 10, symptoms 3, injury. Why doesn't this surprise me? 300 changes. External cause 57, and Z codes had a total of 29 updates or changes. Okay guys? So hopefully by now, after reviewing my previous video that talked about doing the coding updates, you've had a chance to pull up the ICD-10-CM official coding guidelines for fiscal year 2018. Now remember, these codes go into effect from October 1 because ICD-10-CM starts October 1 of each year and it goes through September 30th of the following year. So as we go through and review these guidelines, 117-page document. You guys, I showed you step by step how to find these guidelines on the www.cms.gov website. And in the search box, click on 2018 ICD-10-CM and it will give you these updates. Now remember, these are the most current updates. These are our rules to coding. Okay? And it goes on into our contents page, or table of contents, which tells you what page you can find each one on. And we are going to start at the beginning. All right, and it starts with conventions and general coding guidelines and chapter specific guidelines. Now remember, the conventions or general guidelines and chapter specific guidelines are applicable to all healthcare settings unless otherwise indicated. So that means whether outpatient, inpatient, rehab, psych, you name it. These guidelines apply. And the conventions and instructions of the classification take precedence over these guidelines. So in using your code book, while looking up your code in your alphabetic and then referring to your tabular to verify the code, should your tabular tell you this applies to, or it excludes or it include note, then that takes precedence over these coding guidelines. Now looking at A talks about conventions. Conventions for ICD-10. Now remember, these conventions are general rules for the use of the classification independent of the guidelines. So these are the conventions. These are the steps to using your code book. These conventions are incorporated within the alphabetic index and the tabular list of your ICD-10-CM code book. So remember, in a previous video, I described the difference between your alphabetic index and your tabular list. Remember, your alphabetic index is an alphabetical listing of terms, and it gives you the code to look up in your tabular list, which is a structured list of codes that are divided into chapters based on body systems or conditions. Okay, also in your alphabetic index, there's an index to disease and injury, an index of external cause of injury, the table of neoplasms, and a table of drugs and chemicals. So make sure you are familiar enough with your code books and you know the difference and you know how to find these individual indexes, okay? Then we go right into the format and the structure of the code book. And guys, I have recorded a video on the format and structure, and I talked about, it says here, ICD-10-CM tabular list contains categories, subcategories, and codes. And remember my previous video, I have a quiz in there where you have to describe the difference between the three of these: a category, subcategory, subclassification. Okay? And it even talks about the 7th digit, guys. To ICD-10, we have now expanded our codes from 5 digits to 7 digits long. So codes that have the applicable 7th character, it says here that your code is considered invalid without that 7th character. So make sure you understand in your tabular when a code expands to the 7th digit. And in use of codes for reporting purposes, it says for reporting purposes only, codes are permissible, not categories or subcategories, or it says and any applicable 7th character is required. So remember, if that code expands to the 7th digit, if you submit 4, 5, or 6 codes and not that 7th, that code is invalid. It's incorrect. And that placeholder, remember in ICD-10, we have a placeholder of an X. So if the code only gives you 5 digits, you have to put XX and then the 7th character if there's a 7th character to that code. But I've talked about that in a previous video as well, and I'm going to refer you and show you how to find those videos if you haven't yet found those. And it says here, where a placeholder exists, the X must be used in order for the code to be considered a valid code. Okay? It talks about that 7th character. So let's talk about abbreviations. NEC and NOS. Guys, I have covered that in a previous video as well. And I will refer you to which video it is. But remember, just basically NEC, not elsewhere classified. And that tells you right there, once you get to that code, that's the correct code. And if you see NEC there, that means there is no other code valid today, because it could be updated or changed, that applies to that code. NOS means it's not otherwise specified. Had your physician specifically stated a specified type of disease, you could have coded. Because he didn't, it wasn't otherwise specified, you can't. So you can only code it as basic. A urinary tract infection is just a urinary tract infection. Had he specified an E. coli type of urinary tract infection, then you could code it to that specificity. But because he did not, or she did not, your physician, specify the type of infection, then you cannot code it. Okay? You have a tabular list of abbreviations. There's the NEC and NOS. That means it's in the alphabetic and the tabular. And then we go into punctuations. It's got the brackets. Synonyms are in the brackets. Remember, synonyms are alternative wordings that can be used. Parentheses are used in your alphabetic to include supplementary terms. So again, these guidelines describe these as well as my previous videos, which I'm going to refer you to in just a minute. Moving right along, you have the use of the word and. It tells you right there that that's going to be found in section 1A.14. And we're going to cover that in just a minute, but 8 has been moved down to number 14. Number 9, other and unspecified codes. Again, codes that are titled other or other specified are for the use when the information in a medical record provides detail for which a specific code does not exist. So your alphabetic entry will have an NEC on the line that's designated for other. And these alphabetic entries represent specific disease entities for which there is no specific code or code does not exist. So the term is included within an other code. And that used to be the a .8 code in ICD-9. I used to say, okay, .8 is just a catch-all, and .9 is unspecified. And that leads us right into number B, letter B, 9B, unspecified codes. Codes titled unspecified are for use when the information in the medical record is insufficient to assign a more specific code. And so for those categories for which an unspecified code is not provided, the other specified code may represent both other and unspecified. So a lot of times you'll have those where it's not specified. The physician wasn't as clear as he could have been. Had he been, you could have more accurately coded it. But because he wasn't, you're going to have to grab an unspecified code. And in those cases, it's okay. And then you have your includes notes. This note appears immediately under a 3-character code title for further definition, or it gives examples of the content of the category. So it kind of tells you what's included. You'll see this category of codes includes, and it'll tell you that. And your inclusion terms is a list of terms that are included in some codes. These terms are the codes for which the code is to be used. I appreciate some of those inclusion notes because it lets me know this code includes these diagnoses. So when you see them, you'll know them. And the terms may be synonyms of the code title, like for the common cold. When I got to J029, I was glad to see it because it let me know that that was a synonym for that code. Or in the case of other specified codes, the terms are listed in various conditions assigned to that code. So the inclusion terms are not necessarily exhaustive. That means those are not all terms that could possibly be used, but they are common terms that could be used with a particular code that you may be at. Okay? So those are your includes or inclusion terms. Now also you have your exclude notes. ICD-10 has 2 types of exclude notes. Now this is new to ICD-10. So each type of note has a different definition for use, but they are all similar in that they indicate that codes excluded from each other are independent of each other. For example, you have an excludes 1. Now notice excludes 1. A type 1 excludes note is a pure exclude note. So it means not coded here. It tells you right there, if you have a diagnosis, it led you, and you're looking up in your alphabetic trying to find the correct code assignment. You get to a particular code and oops, in the exclude note, it tells you that diagnosis is an exclude 1. Then that tells you, nope, don't code it here. You're not at the right place. Keep looking. Because an exclude 1 note indicates that the code is excluded and should never be used at the same time as the code that's attached to that exclude 1 note. And so it's saying here that an exclude 1 is used when 2 conditions cannot occur together, such as a congenital form versus an acquired form of the same condition. So you can't be born with something, a condition, for example, sickle cell disease, and then oops, later on acquire it. No, sickle cell is a congenital condition. So in the case of a congenital condition is a congenital condition, not a congenital and an acquired condition. Okay? Now it does have an exception, of course. An exception to the exclude 1 definition is the circumstance when the 2 conditions are unrelated to each other. If it is not clear whether the 2 conditions involving an exclude 1 note are related or not, then query your provider. Send a note to your provider and ask him. So for example, code F45.8, other somatoform disorders, has an exclude note for the sleep-related teeth grinding, which is code G47.63. Because teeth grinding is an inclusion term, means it's included under F45.8, only one of these codes should be assigned for the teeth grinding. However, psychogenic dysmenorrhea is also an inclusion term under F45.8, and a patient could have both of these conditions and sleep-related teeth grinding. So in this case, the 2 conditions are clearly unrelated to each other, and so it would be appropriate to report F45.8 and G47.63. So do note what I'm saying in the first exclude one with the teeth grinding and the somatoform disorders, that somatoform disorder already covers. In other words, it's already included in. It's understood that teeth grinding is included in that one code. But with dysmenorrhea, painful cycles, it says it's included in F45.8. However, a patient can have teeth grinding along with dysmenorrhea. And in that case, you need two codes to encompass both conditions. Now, there's an exclude one, but there's also an exclude two. And when you have an exclude two beside your code, a type 2 exclude note represents not included here as well, but an exclude 2 note indicates that the condition excluded is not part of the condition represented by the code, but a patient may have both conditions at the same time. So when an exclude note appears under a code, it's acceptable to use both codes and the exclude code together, but only when it's appropriate, okay? Only when it's specified. So notice with exclude one, no, you don't code an additional or an exclude one condition. But in exclude two, you can if it applies in that particular case, but you usually don't see those together. Okay, we're down to number 13, etiology and manifestation conditions. Certain conditions have both an underlying etiology and multiple body system manifestations due to underlying etiology. And so for such conditions, the ICD-10-CM has a coding convention that requires the underlying condition be sequenced when? First, if applicable, followed by the manifestation. So you have to make your coding state that had it not been for the underlying condition, for example, diabetes, then this patient wouldn't have diabetic retinopathy. Make sense? So wherever such a combination exists, there is a note that will tell you, use additional code. Okay? Or code first. And that's an instructional note indicating the proper sequencing order of the codes. And that's where you have your etiology followed by your manifestation. And diabetes is a good example of that kind of condition. I'm going to move right along. You guys refer back to this. Now it says there are manifestation codes that do not have in diseases classified elsewhere in the title. So for such, there is an use additional code note at the etiology code and a code first note at the manifestation code, and the rules for sequencing apply. It says an example of an etiology and a manifestation convention is dementia in Parkinson's disease. In your alphabetic index, if you look at code G20, it's listed first, followed by code F02.80 or F02.81. And those are going to be in brackets. So code G20 represents the underlying etiology, Parkinson's disease, and it must be sequenced first, whereas code F02.80 or F02.81 represents a manifestation of dementia in diseases classified elsewhere with or without behavioral disturbance. What this means is if you have a patient that has Parkinson's disease, for example, oops, by the way, they also have dementia, then this requires two codes. Now, the F02.80 is without behavioral disturbance and with behavioral disturbance. That's the only difference in those two codes. But if your patient has Parkinson's disease, and oh, by the way, they also have dementia, then it's telling you that your G20 represents the underlying etiology, which is Parkinson's, which led your patient then to go into dementia. So your Parkinson's disease must be sequenced first, followed by a code for your dementia. So that way your coding is saying, because of the Parkinson's, this patient is now into dementia. And you're showing the etiology manifestation coding sequence by assigning the two codes in the appropriate order. So that's how you use code first and use additional code notes as far as the sequencing rules in your classification system. Okay? What about the word and? And. The word and should be interpreted to mean either and or when it appears in a title. So for example, in the case of tuberculosis of bones, tuberculosis of joints, and in tuberculosis of bones and joints, they are all classified as subcategory A18.0, tuberculosis of bones and joints. So whether your physician says your patient has tuberculosis of bone, you'd use A18.0. If your physician says your patient has tuberculosis of the joints, you'd use A18.0. And if your physician says your patient has tuberculosis of bones and joints, you would still use A18.0. So that and helps you to understand that you're in the right place. What about the term with? Okay, notice how in the with, number 15, or in, is in bold print. That's letting you know that this guideline, let me show you what I've got here. And notice we were under number 1A15. So on your Code 2018 updates, I have a rule here that says for coding convention 1A15 with, the word with or in has been added to this guideline, should be interpreted to mean associated with or due to when it appears in a code title in the alphabetic index or an instructional note in the tabular list. The classification presumes a cause and effect relationship between the two conditions linked by these terms in your alphabetic index or tabular list. These conditions should be coded as related, even in the absence of provider's documentation explicitly linking them, unless the documentation clearly states the conditions are unrelated or when another guideline, notice your 2018 guidelines updates say, or when another guideline exists that specifically requires a documented linkage between two conditions, for example, sepsis guidelines for acute organ dysfunction that is not clearly associated with sepsis. Be careful there. But in any other case, when you see with, understand that it means with or in. Okay? There, it's all included in this one guideline. Just automatically assume there's a cause and effect relationship. So, for conditions that are not specifically linked by these relational terms in the classification, or when a guideline requires that a linkage between two conditions be explicitly documented, your provider documentation must link the conditions in order to code them as related. So, it's understood that there is a cause and effect. With is considered to be in unless your physician specifically does not link the two together, then you don't. But the word with in the alphabetic index is sequenced immediately following the main term. Okay? It's not in alphabetical order. When you look up a term in your alphabetic index, anything that's included with will be immediately following the main term. So watch for that. And when you see with, automatically assume that in, that means it's in that condition, unless your physician specifically states there is no linkage between the two conditions. Now look at C and C also. The C instruction, following a main term in the alphabetic index, it indicates that another term should be referenced. So it's necessary to go to the main term referenced for the C note to locate the correct code. So when I'm in my alphabetic index and I see a C note, I go where that direction tells me to go. Or when it says C also is an instructional following a main term in your alphabetic index, it's instructing you to go to another main term that may also be referenced, that may provide additional information. And a lot of times, guys, it helps me with my locating terms. If I see a C or C also, go there. See what it's telling me to code. Okay? A code also note instructs that there are 2 codes that may be required to fully describe the condition, but this note does not provide sequencing direction. Remember, sequencing depends on the circumstances of the encounter. And I've had a couple of you guys ask me, how do I know when to assign 2 codes? When one code does not fully document or code the condition, then a lot of times it's going to require 2. And a prime example of that is when, for example, pregnancies. A lot of times a patient have a condition in pregnancy and out. So what I know then is it's going to require 2 codes. Another example is, I guess, the diabetic retinopathy I used previously. I said you have to use the diabetes and the diabetic retinopathy. But it will instruct you when 2 codes, but you want to make sure your codes clearly state what's going on with your patient. And then you have default codes. Number 18 says default codes. A code listed next to a main term in the index of ICD-10, in your alphabetic index, may be referred to as a default code. The default code represents that condition that is most commonly associated with the main term or is the unspecified code for the condition. So if a condition is documented in a medical record, for example, appendicitis, without any additional information such as acute or chronic, then the default code, just appendicitis, should be assigned. Because remember, if you go to your main term appendicitis, it's going to say acute, it's going to say chronic, it's going to describe different types of appendicitis. Well, if your physician didn't tell you it was acute or chronic, then just fall back to your default code, which is just appendicitis, and just code that. Don't code acute or chronic, just code appendicitis. And then code assignment and clinical criteria. The assignment of a diagnosis is based on the provider's diagnostic statement that the condition exists. The provider's statement that the patient has a particular condition is sufficient. Code assignment is not based on clinical criteria used by the provider to establish the diagnoses. And guys, what that means, that just means that when you're coding your clinical documentation or you're coding your medical record, always refer to what your physician states. Even if I look and I see where the patient had a urinary tract infection, if my physician didn't state due to E. coli, but yet I can look in the lab and see that the bacteria that grew out was E. coli or staph or strep, and I want to be more specific in my coding and specify that it was a E. coli UTI or a staphylococcal UTI or a streptococcal, if he didn't say it, I can't code it. Okay? So that last number 19 says code assignments and clinical criteria means that as a coder, I can only code what my physician documents. I can query, I can send them a note and say, didn't that patient have a E. coli UTI or a streptococcal UTI? I can ask for that specificity, but if he doesn't give it to me, I can't code it. Okay, guys? All right, guys, that's part A of the coding guidelines, and I have included the 2018 updates in that as well. So that's how I want to do this. As we're going along, I want to include the 2018 updates along with our coding or our review of the coding guidelines to make sure we're covering everything that we need to cover for the coding guidelines and that you guys are up to date. Now, I've had multiple questions about how do you find my channel on YouTube, because your homework assignment between now and the next video where we're going to move on, but I don't want to lose you. And I give examples in previous videos, like my videos 1 through 9 on my channel, go in more detail on every one of these guidelines that we just covered. So I'm going to ask you to go back and look at my videos 1 through 9 on YouTube that will give you examples of the NEC, NOS, code also, sequencing of your codes, etc. So I want to walk you briefly through how to find these coding guidelines, or my channel on YouTube rather, okay? So as you can see, I have YouTube pulled up on my notebook, and there it goes. And in the search box at the top on YouTube, if you will just type in, I'm trying to make sure I get this, guys, in the search on this is on YouTube. If you will type in CodeMasterCoach, and I've been there so many times that it's in memory on my computer, it takes you to a listing of my videos. But y'all, my channel is that purple flowery, and it just says CodeMasterCoach. If you will go to that video, it will take you to my channel, CodeMasterCoach, and under the flower thing right there, there's some tabs: home, video, playlist, community, channels, and about. If you will go to videos, it will take you to a listing of all of my videos. And what I like to do is I always go to when I go to other people's channels, I like to go to the oldest. So over here there's a sort by. And if you sort by, and I like to go to the oldest, date added, oldest first. If you'll do that, it will give you a listing of all of my videos starting with the oldest. And if you will start viewing videos 1 through 9, and they are numbered, look at number 1, number 2. Okay? If you will view videos 1 through 9 between now and the next time we meet to continue going over these guidelines, that will be a good refresher of what we just talked about in today's guidelines. Okay? Okay, guys, I've been back and forth on this camera, so I hope this works out. But in the meantime, do your homework, study. Let's do this together. You can do this. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.